How's it going, folks? I am here today to rank all the FromSoft games, except for these ones, I guess. I'm just ranking these. Demon Souls Remake isn't even made by FromSoftware, so that doesn't really count. And Dark Souls Original, I haven't played because you can't get it on Steam anymore, and keys for it are unbelievably expensive. And also, remastered is practically identical. It just has like some graphical tweaks, and I think there's like a bonfire that they added that should have been there to begin with, and that's pretty much it as far as I'm aware. So it's Dark Souls 1. Don't have to worry about it. But all these other games, the mainline ones, I have played. And after recently playing the Elden Ring DLC Shadow of the Erdtree, I figured now would be as good a time as any to just discuss these. Because I've been meaning to make this video for a while. Because I really like these games. They're some of my favorites now. I didn't get into them until somewhat more recently, but man, yeah, these are some good games. So starting off, of course, with Demon's Souls, but I'm just going to call it Demon Souls because it's Demon's Souls. I'm not saying that. Original PS3 version, of course. I think this game is decent, but to me, Demon Souls is probably the least of any of these entries because it had a lot of very interesting ideas, especially for the time. I mean, you can point to their earlier games like Kingsfield and Shadow Tower and stuff and say, like, oh, well, that's kind of where a lot of these concepts really started. And I guess in some cases, yeah, but Demon Souls is really like the origin of this style of game. Like, this is the first proper Souls title. And because of that, it was very creative. It was very interesting. Like I said, a lot of interesting ideas, but it was also maybe a little too experimental for its own good at some points because there are some aspects of Demon Souls that are just not enjoyable to play, in my opinion. It's really convoluted, even compared to the other games in the series that are known for being kind of convoluted. Like, Demon Souls is like really just bizarre and obtuse and kind of hard to understand what's going on a lot of the time. Like, I remember in my playthrough it took me a long time to even figure out like what I was doing in terms of upgrade materials because there's like a dozen different ones or something. It's crazy. It's weird. I don't know. That being said, I think the atmosphere in Demon Souls is really, really good, and that could be said for pretty much any of these games. I think all of these games have good atmosphere in their own right. But this game needs special mention, especially for areas like the Tower of Latria, which stand out quite a bit as being, like I think Tower of Latria is potentially one of the more memorable areas in the entire series. Maybe not the most fun to play through, but definitely one of the most memorable. And again, the atmosphere plays a huge part in that. Gameplay is fine. Again, it's a little unrefined in comparison to the other games. I think that's what I would classify Demon Souls as in general, is just unrefined. A lot of the concepts that it introduces are improved vastly in Dark Souls and, the games going forward. But it still deserves credit, and for being my least favorite in the series, it's still better than most games. So I'm going to go ahead and put Demon Souls in like B tier. I definitely think it's worth checking out. Dark Souls 1. So I very much enjoy Dark Souls 1. Once again, the atmosphere is absolutely incredible. I think the level design in this one is pretty great as well. People always point to how it like connects back around and it's like, "Oh my god, I'm back in Firelink Shrine. What the fuck? How did that happen?" you know. And that's all very cool. One thing that I don't enjoy as much about Dark Souls 1, I know people are going to think that I'm going to say Lost Izalith, and yes, yeah, I hate Lost Izalith. I hate the Bed of Chaos just like anyone else. But another thing I don't really love about Dark Souls 1 is it's really slow and kind of clunky a lot of the time. Like the combat is good, it's definitely an improvement on Demon Souls, but it's still kind of weird. I don't know what the right word would be because it's not weightless. I would describe Dark Souls 2 combat as weightless, but we'll get to that. It's in fact very weighty in that way, but just something about it doesn't click very well with me. And it might have something to do with the fact that if you're locked on, you can only roll in 4 directions, which is like annoying, but if you just don't lock on, it's not really a problem. And in Dark Souls 1, you don't need to lock on like most of the time, so I think that's the main thing a lot of people point to in terms of the combat in Dark Souls 1 being kind of jank, but I find that that's not even a big deal. I don't know. I think it's just very slow. I guess that's what it is. It's just very slow and it kind of throws me off cuz a lot of the other games in the series like, Bloodborne, Sekiro, Elden Ring are like lightning fast. So going back and playing Dark Souls 1 after any of those is just like you kind of get whiplash when everything is moving at like 50% speed. That being said, I'm not going to pretend that this game isn't amazing because it is. Uh I even like a lot of the areas in the second half, to be honest. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, after you get the Lord Vessel, the game's quality really takes a dip." But like I don't mind the Tomb of the Giants. And I actually like I always forget the name. It's like the Duke's Archives, the Forbidden Archives, whatever it is in that. There's like 100 different locations in these games and games like these that have the word archives in them, but it's that one. It's the one with Seath. I actually like that location. And like the crystal caves and everything. I think those are pretty neat. Obviously, Lost Izalith sucks, but New Londo ain't that bad. I don't know. I really do enjoy this game a lot, but I feel like the more I've replayed it, the more I've kind of just softened on it a lot. It's good. It's really good. I think it's A tier, but I wouldn't quite put it in the same realm that a lot of other people seem to of being like, "Oh, this is the best one." Like out of any of these, Dark Souls 1, it's the classic, it's the best one. It's like, yeah, I mean, if if that's what you enjoy, then that's great, but to me, I don't know. I like the games with kind of more fast, snappy gameplay, I guess, and that kind of brings it down a little bit. But yeah, it's still great. And here we go. Now we're getting into some real controversial territory. Dark Souls 2, and of course, Scholar of the First Sin as well. Which, let's just get this out of the way right now. Scholar is just worse than Dark Souls 2. It looks better, but it plays way worse. I don't really know why they decided to just make a could you even call it an enhanced edition? Not really. I don't get it. I don't get why they even made it. It's essentially just like an optional hard mode, but I wouldn't even call it that. I would call it an optional bullshit mode. And Dark Souls 2 is already kind of bullshit to begin with. I don't know, man. I gotta admit, I have a bit of a soft spot for this game. I think this is one of the worst entries in the series, but it's not terrible. It's just really bizarre and definitely very much an outlier in comparison to all these other ones. Dark Souls 2 is definitely the weirdest of the bunch. I think that goes without saying. It tries a lot of things, like a lot of things, and that's kind of interesting because some of them do fail, like adaptability. Let's just be honest here. It's, adaptability is like the Dark Souls 2 meme for a reason, because it's the stupidest thing they ever decided to put in one of these games, probably. Well, at least top 5. But more so than that, I think there's a lot of things Dark Souls 2 did that succeeded. I mean, like the Ferris Lockstones, for instance. That's actually a pretty cool idea that got brought back in Elden Ring with the Stone Sword keys. And the Stone Sword keys seem to be a pretty well received addition, so I guess we can thank Dark Souls 2 for that. And also, I think this is kind of understated, but I think Dark Souls 2 has some pretty cool looking areas, I'm not gonna lie. No Man's Wharf, Huntsman's Copse, or however you say that, pretty sure it's Huntsman's Copse. The actual castle, like, there's some pretty cool stuff in that game. Even Shrine of Amana, as much as it is an absolute torture fest to play through, it looks really pretty. I think my main gripe with Dark Souls 2, and the main gripe that a lot of people have, is that the combat is just kind of bad. Like, there's really no way to sugarcoat it. It just has bad combat. At the very least, on the PvE side of things, it just feels so weird. I mentioned earlier that it was weightless. I do really think that's the best word to describe it. It is extremely weightless. Everything just feels floaty. I don't know. If you've played Dark Souls 2, I'm sure you know what I mean. It just feels like you and your enemies are in a perpetual state of just floating in a bowl of jelly. It's like there's very little weight to everything. Even using like great swords, it just feels so odd and wrong. Again, it's one of those things that's hard to describe if you haven't played the game, but it's just weird, man. But honestly speaking, I think this game gets a lot more hate than it deserves. It's certainly an odd one, but I can't really bring myself to hate it. In fact, for me, it probably falls somewhere around here. And Scholar, again, it's just Dark Souls 2, but like slightly worse. It's not amazing, but there's something to Dark Souls 2. I was actually considering potentially like doing this, but I don't know. I think all things considered, as much as I would love to be a contrarian weirdo here, Dark Souls is definitely like an objectively better game. And even when I think about it from my personal perspective, I do enjoy playing Dark Souls 1 more. But I don't know. There's something about Dark Souls 2 that kind of appeals to me in a certain way. It's not one that I have replayed frequently, but it's got something. Aha, Bloodborne. My personal favorite of this lineup. I'm just going to get that out of the way. This is the top of S tier for me. I don't think any of these games will probably ever beat Bloodborne. I think personally that this is one of the best games of all time. And that's saying something because it is locked onto the PlayStation 4 and 30 FPS. So that is already two things very much against it. But I mean, hey, if you have a way to play this, it's definitely a must play. I mean, this is, like I said, genuinely one of the best games of all time in my eyes. It's got my personal favorite DLC of all time as well, The Old Hunters, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, FromSoft is known for great DLCs, but I think they really peaked with The Old Hunters. I mean, what can I even say about Bloodborne that hasn't been said 100,000 times already? I mean, what could I say about any of these games that hasn't been said 100,000 times? But especially Bloodborne. People love talking about this game, and for good reason. I really think that just about everything surrounding this game is about as good as it can be. The gameplay is fantastic. The lore and story is really cool. The art style, I mean, just look at like a screenshot of Bloodborne and you'll know what I mean. This game has some of the best art ever in any game. It just does. It's unbelievably cool to look at. It's got a pretty good amount of content and build variety. It's very replayable. The music is fantastic. I mean, there's so little I would change about Bloodborne. And honestly, pretty much anything I would change would just be technical things, you know. People say that we need like a Bloodborne remake, but I honestly very much disagree with that. I wouldn't mind a remaster exactly, but I would definitely prefer if they left any changes out. Honestly, I think all this game really needs is just a PC port, 60 FPS, and maybe a fresh coat of paint on like the graphical fidelity, because that is showing its age a little bit. It's not even that bad, but there are just a couple areas in the game that look a little odd now. But I mean, even in its worst moments, this game is S tier, and I'm not gonna pretend otherwise. It's right up there. Like I said, it's nothing else on this list is gonna beat it. Sorry, but that's just how it is. I just love Bloodborne, man. It's such a good game. That's all I really have to say about it. It's just that good. It's one of those bizarre situations where people hype it up as being like one of the best things ever, and you're like, ah, well, it can't be that good. And then you play it and you're like, oh, all right, it actually is that good. Or at least that's what it was like for me. But yeah, damn, Bloodborne's such a good game. They then follow that up with Dark Souls 3, which was actually the first one of these games that I played through all the way. And it was definitely the one that got me into this series. Dark Souls 3 is kind of a interesting beast in that when I first played it, I thought this is like one of the best games I've ever played. It's so freaking cool. Going back and replaying it more recently, I don't know. It's still very good, and I like it a lot, but I don't think I have quite the same thoughts on it as I did initially. I suppose you could say it's a kind of honeymoon phase of a game, right? But I think more so than anything, just playing the other games in this series that don't have souls in the title have kind of made me realize that I think the actual Dark Souls and Demon Souls games are like my least favorite ones overall. And again, you know, least favorite of a series that I really enjoy, so that's not saying a whole lot, but it's just one of those situations where I played through the Dark Souls games and I loved them, but then I feel like the other games just kind of do more interesting things with the formula a lot of the time. Dark Souls 3, for instance, is again a very good game, and I think its main strength definitely has to be the combat. It kind of takes what was started with these games here, Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 and 2, and then combines that with the more frantic, fast pace of Bloodborne, and I think it works very well. The combat in Dark Souls 3 is great. That being said, I think the levels in Dark Souls 3 aren't quite as good as previous entries. I'm not going to complain about the linearity of the game exactly, because that's something a lot of people like to point to as like a big negative with Dark Souls 3. And while I do understand that, it doesn't exactly bother me that much. More so, I just think there's a lot of areas in this game that I just don't like. It's like the High Wall of Lothric is really cool, and I actually really like the Undead Settlement as well. But then after that, you know, you got like the Crucifixion Woods, which is like really cool to look at, but not that amazing to play through. And then you got the Cathedral of the Deep, which is similarly not that fun because then you get down into the freaking poison swamp. And then there's Farron Keep, which is just a giant poison swamp. And then there's the freaking Catacombs of Carthus, which are also kind of annoying. You know, it's just like, it's a lot of areas that are just not super fun. And while I don't personally sprint through these games to get to the bosses that often, I can definitely understand why someone would do that with Dark Souls 3, especially. Because the bosses are, for the most part, actually really, really good. Like some of the better offerings in the series up till this point. I think Bloodborne still has it beat in a lot of respects in terms of bosses, but Dark Souls 3 also has some of the highlights of the series, like Slave Knight Gale, Nameless King, Midir, Soul of Cinder, you know, etc. So while I do feel like Dark Souls 3 is more of a mixed bag for me now than when I first played it, I still have to put it pretty high. It is definitely my favorite of the Dark Souls games, though I'm unsure now that I'm talking about it whether I would put it in low S or at the top of A. I'm going to throw it here for now, and I'll go back through this once I'm finished and just kind of rearrange if I feel like it's necessary. But I do want to clarify, I really like Dark Souls 3 a lot. It's just that, you know, I've mellowed on it a bit. I think that's the word I was looking for earlier with Dark Souls 1, because it's a similar situation with both of these games. It's like the first couple playthroughs were fantastic and they really got me excited about this series, but after playing other games that sort of surpass these in a lot of ways, I've mellowed on them a bit. Again, a bit. I still love them. Sekiro. Now, this is a game that I put off playing for a while. I really wanted to still have a FromSoft game to play, if that makes any sense. Like, I wanted the feeling of knowing that there was a FromSoft game that I hadn't played, I guess is a better way to put it. But, you know, eventually I played it, and it's unbelievably good. I absolutely adore Sekiro. I think, genuinely, the combat system is the best out of any of these, and I would say potentially the best melee combat that's ever been put into a video game. I know that sounds like a pretty bold claim, but I'm really trying to think of anything that would be better, and I can't. I've certainly never played a game with better melee combat than this. It is absolutely wonderful. It's so satisfying to chain deflects and learn movesets and just well, that's the thing. You don't even have to learn movesets. You can just feel it out so much more in this game than the others. It's a game that I would classify as difficult but not excruciating by any means, and almost entirely skill based. I'm not going to say entirely, because there's some fights, unfortunately, that are just kind of bullshit, but, you know, most of those are optional. Looking at you, headlesses. But the majority of, like, the main bosses, at least in this game, are absolutely phenomenal. So I really have nothing to complain about. This is another one of those games like Bloodborne that I think is near perfect, though perhaps slightly less so than Bloodborne, because like I said, Sekiro does have the occasional boss and enemy that just doesn't flow well with this kind of game at all, and I don't really know why they put that kind of stuff in. It's just weird, but in this game's best moments, it's one of the best video games I've ever played. I really believe that. So I'm definitely putting it in S tier. Also, another nice thing is that for once the story is actually pretty comprehensible. You can tell what's going on mostly, and you can follow it. It's great. I think this is my second favorite one of these games, and I wouldn't have really expected that with what little I had played of it initially, but yeah, after putting in one playthrough, I ended up playing it through another, like, I don't know, 4 times or something directly after, 3 or 4, somewhere in that range, because I wanted to beat all the bosses, like, you know, the inner bosses and the secret ones and stuff, like the other endings. And I did. And man, I don't know what else to say other than this game is a masterpiece. And finally, we come to Elden Ring, a game that I have many a problem with, but I still find to be absolutely incredible despite all of that. Like I said, I have a lot of problems with this game. It has a lot of things that bring it down a little bit. There's a lot of very empty open world stuff after you beat Morgott. Some of the game balance is also pretty weird after that point. Like the late game of Elden Ring is definitely I don't want to say the worst part because there's a lot of really interesting aspects of it, but it's definitely the worst balanced part and it has a lot of issues with it. It doesn't necessarily feel rushed, but it doesn't feel exactly finished either in some places, if that makes any sense. That being said, deciding to put this style of game in an open world was a very bold move, and I think it paid off pretty well. Yes, you can point to how repeat playthroughs can be a little bit tedious, I suppose would be the word. Considering, well, you know that a lot of the items in the open world that you can get from dungeons and towers and stuff are not actually going to help you in any way. So that can definitely make you skip a lot of content on your, second, third, etc. playthrough. But the first playthrough of Elden Ring is generally pretty incredible. I do believe that the player side combat in Elden Ring is some of the best stuff they've made. A lot of the enemies can be kind of annoying, do a lot of damage, have really, really endless combos. But the player gets a lot of really cool stuff as well, and the game feels great to play. It also has one of my favorite DLCs now. Shadow of the Erdtree is my second favorite FromSoft DLC behind, as I said, the Old Hunters for Bloodborne. I don't really think anything is going to beat the Old Hunters for me, but the fact that it even came close is pretty impressive in its own right. I loved Shadow of the Erdtree, and frankly, a lot of the issues that I had with Elden Ring's late game design that I mentioned earlier just weren't nearly as present in the DLC. With a couple exceptions, a lot of the enemies and bosses just felt way more balanced to me. But looking at Elden Ring now as a complete package with itself and its DLC, it's just an amazing game. It really is. And I don't think I can put it any lower than right there. I do believe it's my third favorite. So let me just look through this, see if there's anything that I would change. These three are definitely staying where they are. Dark Souls 3, man, I feel bad not putting this in S tier. I really want to, because its best moments are certainly like way up here, maybe even like here. But it's not. It's a game that, while it is defined by its best moments, there are quite a few lower points of just tedium and running through boring levels and stuff. So I think it's got to stay here for the moment. Yeah. Dark Souls. Yeah, I can't in good conscience put Dark Souls 2 above 1. I can't do that. I can't. I occasionally feel like I like 2 more than 1, but 1 is just so much more playable, man. Demon Souls down there. Yeah, I think this is a pretty good list. Yeah. So if there's any takeaway from this, I guess let it be that I really, really like these games a lot. Bloodborne is one of my favorite games of all time, if not my absolute favorite. And yeah, Sekiro and Elden Ring ain't far behind. And honestly, pretty much all these other games are pretty far up there as well. I love the stuff that FromSoft does. I think they're one of the more creative developers out there, especially in terms of like AAA devs. They might be the best. They pretty constantly put out quality, and I really appreciate that. But yeah, that's my list. I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble on about these games, if you even made it this far. If not, that's fine too. And you're also not listening to this, so I don't know why I said that. Never mind. All right, that's it. Bye.